and welcome back to the most amazing channel on the internet. I'm your host Rebecca Felgate, and today we're talking about the top 10 scary prison experiments. Just because people are incarcerated, does it mean that they should be the subject to experimentation? I'm saying no. No. Do let me know your thoughts about that in the comment section down below. Also, if you like our prison videos, do make sure you leave a thumbs up so we know. If you guys want to connect with the creative team that went into making these videos, then check out the links to our social media in the description box. Coming in at number 10, we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment is one of the most famous and controversial psychological studies of all time. Like the name suggests, the tests were researched and carried out at Stanford University, one of the world's leading teaching and research institutions. The test took place over 45 years ago in 1971 and involved a group of students who probably just wanted to make a bit of holiday cash. The 24 students were divided equally into prisoners and guards and were led into a makeshift jail in the basement of the research center. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks but was abruptly called off after 6 days. Why? Well, day 1 seemed more like roleplay, but by the second day it was almost as if all involved had become brainwashed into thinking they were prisoners and guards. One of the lead researchers was drawn into the experiment, and one of the students chosen to play a guard started acting very cruelly. The prisoners responded by blockading themselves in a cell. The guards then all started to see this as a challenge and began using physical force to break up their demonstration. As one of the researchers was taking part, he couldn't say, "Hey, stop!" By the end of the 6th day, prisoners had been beaten, stripped naked, deprived of sleep, and humiliated. Only when a fellow psychologist stumbled upon the experiment and intervened, calling the experiment cruel and depraved, was it called off. The experiment is regularly cited today as a key example of mob mentality, and also showcased the ability for seemingly balanced people to succumb to cruelty. Coming into number 9, we have the perfume experiments. Some dark things went down in the Holmesburg prison in Philadelphia between the 50s and the 70s. The perfume experiments was a name given to the test by the prisoners themselves. So basically, what went down was that scientists at the University of Pennsylvania were working with Dow Chemical, Johnson & Johnson, and the United States Army. Together they were injecting inmates of the prison with powerful toxic chemicals in order to test what their skin reaction would be. They also spiked their toothpaste, their personal cleaning products, and more. It's estimated that 90% of prisoners were tested on, and the majority of those were black. One of the leading scientists said that he walked into the prison and saw the inmates, viewing them only as a field of skin. He said it was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. What a sicko. Coming into number 8, we have the syphilis experiments. These are simply awful. Between 1946 and 1948, during the Hoover administration, Americans conducted experiments on Guatemalans. They gave doctors syphilis to inject into prisoners and other members of what they considered low society, such as prostitutes. Nobody, including the prisoners, knew that they were being doped with sexually transmitted diseases. The experiment resulted in at least 83 deaths. Those are just the documented ones anyway. In October 2010, the United States formally apologized to Guatemala for conducting these experiments. Coming into number 7, very famous, we have the MKUltra mind control experiment. A lot of you may already know about MKUltra and the mind control experiments conducted in the United States in the 1950s through to the 1970s. MKUltra used numerous methods to manipulate people's mental states and alter brain functions. This included doping unwitting people with LSD and other chemicals, as well as hypnosis and sensory deprivation, and forms of torture such as isolation, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, and battery. MKUltra experiments were largely conducted on prisoners who had no idea what was happening to them. The full extent of MKUltra and its testing on both civilians and prisoners isn't known, as in the 1970s, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files to be destroyed. Surviving documents have since been declassified. Coming into number 6, we have the radiation tests. As part of the United States' controversial Manhattan Project, the name given to research and development that led to the creation of the first nuclear weapons, a lot of people were worried that the exposure of nuclear materials such as plutonium and uranium would do a lot of damage to the scientists involved. So, what did they do? They infected United States prisoners with biochemical agents in order to measure their reaction. In the mid-1940s and beyond to the 1970s, prisoners in Washington and Oregon State, as well as pregnant women at universities, were doped with nuclear chemicals in human radiation experiments. How absolutely vile. Other prisoners were not injected but had their testicles irradiated, which caused severe birth defects to children they went on to have. We only know about these because Bill Clinton declassified records from the 1940s. Coming into number 5, we have the poison chamber. In secret Soviet laboratories 1 and 12, some seriously nasty stuff was happening to prisoners. What happened in these experimentation cells has led to the development of a lot of traceless poisons used today to, say, kill spies in Salisbury. Prisoners from gulags, who were dubbed as enemies of the people, were exposed to mustard gas, ricin, cyanide, and more. The end goal of the experiments was to find a tasteless, odorless chemical that could kill people and not be picked up in post-mortem processes. Basically an untraceable poison that could be used in future assassinations. Prisoners were fed these chemicals as part of a meal or a drink, and of course many of them died. From this process, the Soviets found C2. This was a silent and quick killer. Coming into number 4, we have Unit 731. Unit 731 was a biological and chemical warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. The covert center used prisoners of war as well as civilians for dark, twisted experimentation. In these times, some of the most atrocious war crimes ever known to man were committed. The unit was based in what is now China but used to be part of Japan. As this list is about prison experiments, I'm not going to go into what they did to the general public, but that was pretty unforgivable too, so definitely worth some research in your own time if you're interested. At this center, Allied prisoners of war, especially Americans, were subjected to some very, very brutal stuff. In these experiments, prisoners were injected with salt water and many were subjected to vivisections, the removal of organs while a person is still alive. Often this was done without any anesthesia. Some prisoners had limbs amputated in order to study blood loss. These were sometimes attached to the opposite sides of their body, just for fun, I guess. There are rumors that some of the Japanese army even ate human organs that were removed. On top of that, prisoners were injected with diseases and exposed to chemical weapons. Many prisoners, for example, were infected with the plague. Perhaps even worse than the experimentations themselves was the reaction from the United States. Instead of holding the scientists accountable, Japanese research involved were secretly given immunity by the US in exchange for the data they gathered through human experimentation. So all of the human experiments on this list so far are from the past, but it is rumoured that number 3 and number 2 are still happening. Coming into number 3, we have the zombies of Camp 22. North Korea has concentration camps, or so the defectors say, the worst of which is said to be Camp 22. The camp was at one point thought to be closed, but it seems that the desolate location near the Chinese border is still very much active. I must say that none of these allegations have been proven, but that's basically because no one can get anywhere near the Hermit Nation. Former guards of the prison and former prisoner Lee Son-ok have had a lot to say about it. Miss Lee said that in her camp of 6,000 prisoners, they were all subjected to water torture and other types of abuse. She also said that they were exposed to dark chemical experimentations. One former head of security at Camp 22 said that the camp conducted suffocation experiments on families. Guards would watch how long it would take for different family members to drop dead in a room filled with gas. It's also thought that the camp was used to experiment with some surgical procedures, with some sensational claims that the camp was turning people into brain-dead zombies. Next up, apparently still going on at number 2, we have Guantanamo ballooning. Former prisoners from Guantanamo Bay have claimed that they were the victims of human experimentation, which is a crime as we know. Guantanamo was set up in 2002 by George W. Bush amid his war on terror. Guantanamo is very contentious today, but Trump is adamant that the facilities stay open. A number of sources say that prisoners are given quote-unquote truth serum when they're imprisoned. This is alleged to be a malaria-fighting drug not being used for purpose, but instead to exploit its side effects, which make prisoners volatile. This would also lead them to experiencing hallucinations, but very susceptible to manipulation. Like the research for MKULTRA was hoping, basically. One former prisoner, Murat Kunas, has accused guards of medical torture. He said that he was forced to take a malaria drug despite not being exposed to the sickness. He also also said that he was regularly injected with substances that he didn't know what they were. He said that some of his fellow inmates were suddenly ballooning with swollen heads, swollen hands, and swollen bodies filled with water. Some people have expressed concerns that the practice is medical waterboarding. Awful, and whether this is happening right now we don't know for sure, but if it is, this is definitely pretty scary. I don't know, maybe this is more than scary, perhaps it's nightmarish. And speaking of nightmarish, we had to mention it on this list. One of the most famous scary prison experiments of all time. Coming into number 1, we have the Nazi twin experiments. Joseph Mengele was the leading doctor at a medical facility in Auschwitz, the most famous concentration camp for prisoners of the insane Nazi regime. Auschwitz and the wider treatment of prisoners by the Nazis is often considered to be one of the worst instances of war crimes. No prisoner of the Nazis was unaffected by their absolute cruelty. We know that Nazis used killer gas to murder a vast number of prisoners during the Second World War, mostly Jewish people, but since the fall of the Third Reich, the extent of Nazi depravity has been revealed. One of the worst of them was Dr. Mengele. He abused twins, injecting one with poison whilst the other watched. He would pull off twins' limbs and attach them to their siblings. He would inject dye into their eyes to try and make them look different. There are even reports that some of the twins were surgically attached to one another. If one twin died, the other was killed immediately. Their body parts would later be dissected for comparison. Mengele didn't just save his sick experiments for twins only. He's also said to have sawn off the head of sick prisoners to study where the illness came from. Now, unfortunately, after the war, Dr. Mengele escaped Auschwitz for South America and was never caught. So guys, what a list! That was the top 10 scary prison experiments. What did you think to this? Let me know in the comment section down below. We always absolutely love reading your comments. I know this has been a bit of a stressful list, but hopefully you have found it interesting. Please do leave a thumbs up to let us know that you like this kind of content, share it with a friend, and stay subscribed for more most amazing lists. Bye!